The last lecture was about Carl Jung and his view of the collective unconscious, and the last thing he said was, these archetypal images belong to humanity at large and can crop up spontaneously in anybody's head at any time and place. The suitable moment for this is always when a particular view of the world is collapsing, sweeping away all the formulas that purported to offer final answers to the great problems of life. So this lecture is going to be quotes from two thinkers who think that Western society has basically come to an end. It's becoming self-destructive, it's destroying the earth, and these images, people in their dreams are starting to re-envision and see the way out. Okay, so the society, the way we've constructed it, is collapsing. We know things about the universe that tell us we've been out of sync. We're disintegrated with ourselves and with nature, and they're suggesting the reemergence of the feminine principle, the principle of nurturing and connecting with nature and each other. And so the first few excerpts will be from Edward Whitmont, who wrote The Return of the Goddess, and then most of my excerpts will be from a book by a woman who calls herself Starhawk, and it's called The Spiral Dance, and she talks about witchcraft, which is simply the rituals used in relationship to goddess worship, the worship of the goddess. So this is what Whitmont says. The new world view, ushered in by 20th century physics, conceives of a continuous flux of process, vibrational fields, quantum pulses of an indefinite non-material substratum. It's a self-directed flow that gives form. The dynamics of our world do not flow from a maker or director outside of it, who manipulates it like an object. The world is inner or self-directed, an immanence groping for self-realization in the 3 dimensions of space and the 4th dimension of time. Consciousness and conscience now discover self-direction. They find themselves in relation to the newly emerging feminine as inner directed awareness with its growing transformative aspect, time. The new holistic consciousness perceives human existence as an aspect of a unitary cosmic organism. From that perspective, conscience is an inherent potentiality which underlies existence, rather than a quasi-accidental byproduct of man-made culture. The new conscience functions by virtue of being sensitive to what wills to be born anew in any new situation or time. Out of the depths of the dark abyss, it is sensitive to patterns in events. The inner voice can be differentiated from inner caprice. It speaks to the ego from the depths of the unconscious psyche as a subjective experience, just as formerly a like power addressed itself to the individual through the collective God-given law. So, this is the view that the universe is all about energy is really Greek, and Aristotle has not been interpreted that way, but that's because it's been read by men who have been conditioned to think in the way of their culture, so they will project their training onto the texts. So Aristotle actually thought that all the powers of the human psyche, or any psyche, the universe is really driven by powers and potentialities becoming actual. And so this notion of energy in motion and energy being formed is really very much like the Greeks, and the Greek view, I think, culminates in Aristotle. But the new consciousness is also a result of many other centuries of human development. So we will have to, the emergence of the feminine will have to take place within a very high tech context. We're not going to be able to preserve natural equilibrium without being able to use all of our high tech equipment to measure exactly what harm we're doing and how best to bring ourselves back into some kind of reasonable integrated relationship with culture. But Whitmont goes on. At the low point of a cultural development that has led us into the deadlock of scientific materialism, technological destructiveness, religious nihilism, and spiritual impoverishment, a most astounding phenomenon has occurred. A new mythological view is arising in our midst and asks to be integrated into our modern frame of reference. It is the myth of the ancient goddess who once ruled earth and heaven before the advent of the patriarchy and of the patriarchal religions. The goddess is now returning. Since there is a high probability that the human species has developed through evolution, it makes little sense to assume this biologically but disregard it psychologically. Human consciousness is historically layered. It consists of the neo-mammalian cortical areas. Second, beneath that operates the affect-generating limbic system. Third, the still more primitive reptilian brain is concerned primarily with adaptation and survival. Hence, we may assume that the psychological development of the individual replicates the evolutionary history of mankind. Beneath our rational modern mind lie dormant the matriarchal, magical, and mythological perception and concept formations, the limbic and reptilian affects, aggression, defense, and survival adaptations. From the standpoint of our most recently acquired neo-mammalian awareness, these earlier strata appear unconscious. The history of the evolution of consciousness is in part a history of ever new longings, of conflict and struggle. The externalization and projection of the inner struggle upon our fellow human beings gives rise to what we call the historical process. And I would say that the history of interpretation of Greek culture and Plato and Aristotle is very much an externalization and projection of the inner struggle of the scholars who read those texts. And they have an agenda. They either want to disregard those texts or they want to promote those texts, but always with their own assumptions in mind. So Whitmont goes on. While old values are breaking down, a new consciousness is also being born. The external problems and themes of humankind are to be wrestled with in new ways. We seek new forms of self-validation and of relating to our emotional and instinctual urges. Yet paradoxically, these new ways require a retrieval of old, seemingly discarded and repressed modes of functioning. The magical, mythological, and feminine ways of dealing with existence, left behind thousands of years ago, must now be reclaimed by consciousness. Okay, and so Starhawk is one person who is trying to reclaim it by recreating, as much as she can figure out, some of the old rituals and beliefs of goddess worship, and then also inventing it, developing it in a new way, testing to see what is most effective at digging deep into the psyche and getting us to activate this nurturing principle and integrate that into our lives and into our culture. So, but she starts at the beginning. She said, Witchcraft began more than 35,000 years ago when the temperature of Europe began to drop. In the lands once covered with ice, a new power was discovered. It was found that certain stones increase the flow of power. Priestesses could probe the secrets of time and the hidden structure of the cosmos. Mathematics, astronomy, poetry, music, medicine, and the understanding of the workings of the human mind developed side by side with the lore of the deeper mysteries. So, this is the idea that it was women way back, priestesses, who first made that transition from sensation, perception, imagination, memory, and experience to see, you remember something like that happening before, to that leap from the particular to the universal, understanding the universe is based on order and it has causes and principles, and we can understand them, we can get in touch with them, we can make sense of our lives, we can and we can create a culture that keeps us in tune with the forces of the universe. So those women, those priestesses, started to develop basic, what we would call rudimentary mathematics, astronomy, poetry, music, medicine, um, and uh, rituals, techniques for keeping the psyche balanced, integrated, whole, digging deep into the positive and negative energies. So that's her claim. The symbolism of the goddess is not a parallel structure to the symbolism of God the Father. The goddess does not rule the world. She is the world. Manifest in each of us, she can be known internally by every individual in all her magnificent diversity. She does not legitimize the rule of either sex by the other, and lends no authority to rulers of temporal hierarchies. In witchcraft, each of us must reveal our own truth. Deity is seen in our own forms, whether female or male, because the goddess has her male aspect. Sexuality is a sacrament. Religion is a matter of relinking with the divine within and with her outer manifestations in all of the human and natural world. Now, when Aristotle says practical wisdom is to be the truth, right? You are really living what the truth is. You can go back to the goddess and say, she is being, right? She doesn't rule the being. She's not separate from her creation. She is the world. And as the world evolves, the goddess evolves. All of the different layers of evolution are simply parts of the goddess, personified in different personifications, okay? The importance of the goddess symbol for women and men. She's arguing that this new symbol, this new kind of way to relating to yourself, is important for both women and men. The image of the goddess inspires women to see ourselves as divine, our bodies as sacred, the changing phases of our lives as holy, our aggression as healthy, our anger as purifying, and our power to nurture and create, but also to limit and destroy when necessary, as the very force that sustains all life. Through the goddess we can discover our strength, enlighten our minds, own our bodies, and celebrate our emotions. We can move beyond narrow, constricting roles and become whole. Now, that description of women shouldn't just be for women. Hopefully, men would listen to that and think about, oh, don't I normally think that way? And probably not. And the culture really molds people not to think this way. And it's basic, it's only humane, but it's not what we see when we walk outside and look at advertising and things. The goddess is also important for men. The oppression of men in Father God ruled patriarchy is less obvious but no less tragic than that of women. Men are encouraged to identify with a model no human being can successfully emulate, to be the mini rulers of narrow universes. Our relationship to the earth and the other species that share it has also been conditioned by our religious models. The image of God as outside of nature has given us a rationale for our own destruction of the natural order and justified our plunder of the earth's resources. We have attempted to conquer nature as we have tried to conquer sin, only as the results of pollution and ecological destruction become severe enough to threaten even urban humanity's adaptability have we come to recognize the importance of ecological balance and the interdependence of all life. Now, and the issue there is we can understand this in this very left brained way, and yet we don't change the way we live, and we also are not in touch with these deeper impulses and drives, and that's what Starhawk wants. You have to go deep. You have to really want to have personal integrity along with this understanding that we need to stop destroying the natural world. She also describes witchcraft in a way which again corresponds to Aristotle, with his virtues and vices and his mean between the extremes. But this is just the human condition, so shouldn't be a surprise. Witchcraft recognizes that any virtue becomes a vice unless it is balanced by its own opposite. Beauty, when unsustained by strength, is vapid and lifeless. Power is insufferable when untempered by compassion. Honor, unless balanced by humility, becomes arrogance. And mirth, when not deepened by reverence, becomes mere superficiality. We learn the mystery that unless we find the goddess within ourselves, we will never find her without. She's both internal and external. And her last point here is that desire, the goddess is the goal of desire. Desire is the glue of the universe. It binds the electron to the nucleus, the planet to the sun, and so creates form, creates the world. To follow desire to its end is to unite with that which is desired, to become one with it, with the goddess. We are already one with the goddess. She's been with us from the beginning. So fulfillment becomes self-awareness, which goes back to this whole theme about thought thinking itself. People becoming aware that we are the universe, becoming conscious of itself. We understand the order that underlies what we see. Also, the point about desire is important because in the Greek texts, this is described as eros. And eros in Hesiod's creation story is one of the four original forces of the universe. It's a force of creativity. Unfortunately, Hesiod was misogynist, which I'll point out. And so Eros got perverted. But I think Hesiod's worried about this perversion. And then later on, especially in Plato, Eros comes back. And we have a conversation about Eros in the symposium. So people thought a lot about Eros in the Greeks, and I'll talk about that quite a bit. For women, the goddess is the symbol of the inmost self and the beneficent, nurturing, liberating power within women. The cosmos is modeled on the female body, which is sacred. All phases of life are sacred. Okay, the horned god represents powerful, positive male qualities that derive from deeper sources than the stereotypes and the violence and emotional crippling of men in our societies. If man had been created in the horned God's image, he would be free to be wild without being cruel, angry without being violent, sexual without being coercive, spiritual without being unsexed, and able to truly love. Um, okay, so this idea uh, is these two forces are very much a part of Greek mythology and tragedy and Homer and Plato. And again, the way the Greek texts teach is through catharsis. So they magnify all the ways things can go wrong. And often I think one of the main themes is the way this male aggression um, hurts females. The males damage women all the time in many different ways, and I think the artists know that part of their message in their art is always to get men to flush that out and become more balanced. The balance of the god and goddess energies. Um, okay, the god is Eros, but he's also Logos, the power of the mind. In witchcraft, there's no opposition between the two, and I will point this out in Plato, but it's there all the time. And it's there in Delphi. It's there throughout the texts. The bodily desire for union and the emotional desire for connection are transmuted into the intellectual desire for knowledge, which is also a form of union. And so this union is a correspondence, right? And there's an energy between the knower and the known, between the lover and the beloved, um, throughout throughout the human condition. And she's talking about it here, and I'll talk about it in the Greeks. Knowledge can be both analytic and synthetic, can take things apart and look at differences, or form a pattern from unintegrated parts and see the whole. So all the texts assume the artists had been able to see the whole, but the texts describe gods and human beings analyzing, synthesizing, using scientific method to argue that they ought to make this choice or that choice. Often they use their scientific reasoning skills to argue for the wrong choice, but the powers are all there, and there's a message about how they ought to be ordered in relationship to each other in order to promote human flourishing, for human beings simply to be fully human. Okay, then she talks about spells, which of course this is outside of our comfort zone, but I think we ought to think about it. Spells go one step further than most forms of psychotherapy. They allow us not only to listen to and interpret the unconscious, but also to speak to it in the language it understands. Symbols, images, and objects used in spells communicate directly with the younger self, who is the seat of our emotions and who is barely touched by the intellect. We often understand our feelings and behavior, but find ourselves unable to change them, which is exactly what Aristotle said. The intellectual virtues, the capacity for logos, are disconnected from the moral virtues. The moral virtues start in the pleasure and pain center, right? In our emotions and our drives, and they have to be habituated. Eventually, they connect with intellectual virtues, but the purely intellectual virtues can also be trained in relationship to any kind of emotional outlook, and the characters in Greek texts make that pretty clear. The primary principle of magic is connection. The universe is a fluid, ever-changing energy pattern, not a collection of fixed and separate things. What affects one thing affects in some way all things. All is interwoven into the continuous fabric of being. Its warp and weft are energy, which is the essence of magic. Energy is ecstasy, When we drop the barriers and let power through, it floods the body, pulsing through every nerve, arousing every artery, coursing like a river that cleanses as it moves. And so her idea of dropping the barriers is the Greek idea of removing an obstacle. So catharsis is removing an obstacle. There's an obstacle in your body that's making you physically unhealthy, and there's an obstacle in your mind, which is a false opinion or a delusion that needs to be removed so that you can see the truth, okay? The wise person simply sees what's there. It's just that we're born ignorant and blind, and we have to, there's a long process. And so education in a lot of ways is just removing the obstacles, making you aware of what was already there. The laws of ecology are the laws of energy. Everything's interconnected. Every action, every movement of forces changes the universe. The world is in balance, in equilibrium. The first type of energy is elemental energy. It is the subtle force of the elements: earth, air, water, fire, plants, and animals. Elemental vitality sustains the physical body. The second type of energy can be thought of as the energy of consciousness, of thought, dreams, fantasies, and mind. Okay? And then there's also the shadow. So the dark side, which Jung talks about, and I'll talk about in, I think, the next lecture. She talks about that too. The shadow is the embodiment of all the impulses and qualities we've thrust into the unconscious because the conscious mind finds them unacceptable. All that we are and feel we should not be: sexual, angry, hostile, vulnerable, masochistic, self-hating, guilty, and even powerful or creative, squats in the doorway between younger self and talking self. Okay, just between conscious and unconscious. So, just like Aristotle said, it's not bad to be sexual or angry. You just have to learn how to be sexual or angry at the right reason, in the right way, toward the right person. Okay, and finally, she concludes. She is trying to find out about what we've known in the past about this witchcraft, but ultimately she has to take it into the present and the future, and she wants to integrate it with what we now know. All right, I would like to see the goddess religion of the future be firmly grounded in science, in what we can observe in the physical world. Observation is meditation. As the builders of Stonehenge knew well, the builders of Stonehenge were, which is a temple, an astronomical observatory, a calendar, and a calculator all at once. Witchcraft has always been an empirical religion. Herbs, spells, and practices were constantly tested and results compared at gatherings of the covens. The old symbols were drawn from observation of recurring patterns in nature. Some have merely been deepened by our expanded knowledge of those patterns. For example, the spiral was the ancient symbol of death and rebirth. We now recognize it as the shape of the DNA molecule, which sets the pattern for an organism's growth, and so takes it on another level of meaning. In future or contemporary goddess religion, a photograph of the earth as seen from space might be our mandala. We might meditate on the structure of the atom, as well as icons of ancient goddesses. Physics, mathematics, ecology, and biochemistry more and more approach the mystical. New myths can take their concepts and make them numinous, so that they infuse our attitudes and actions with wonder at the richness of life. Without discarding science, we can recognize its limitations. There are many modes of consciousness that have not been validated by Western scientific rationalism, in particular what I call starlight awareness, the holistic, intuitive mode of perception of the right hemisphere of our brains. As a culture, we are experiencing a turn toward the intuitive. So, the conclusion here is that no matter what associations you might have with the notion of witchcraft, which I mean, was wouldn't imagine I would be getting into witchcraft, but really, if you just think of it, it starts with the earth and nurturing and creativity, birth, evolution. What could be more obvious than that? And then this incredible desire to understand, and it developed into this sophisticated linking between understanding the outside world, the part of it that people were capable of understanding. So as the witchcraft developed, it was always developed based on learning more and more about the natural world, and then learning more and more about cultivating meaningful human culture in harmony with the natural world. Also, taking those deep energies of both creativity uh, and violence, positive, negative, aggression, nurturing. So, all the energies that we have that we really have to have in order to survive, and balancing them, figuring out what sort of rituals, spells, what sort of mythology, stories, what kind of music, what kind of dance. So they brought in all those muses that Hesiod talks about. So Hesiod, just in his story, he's recognizing that poetry, music, all nine of the muses together make up a collective mind, nous. And so we can figure out that witchcraft had its epic poetry. It would have its narrative about stories about the human condition, about characters that had were no longer simply arbitrary stories about particular people, but the witchcraft, the people who desired to know, had figured out archetypal stories, mythological stories. I'm sure they had their hymns to the gods. I'm sure they had their love poetry. They had their music. They had their dance. They had their probably tragedy and comedy. And they had their astronomy and astrology. And they had their history. So I mean, even though we can't recover all of this, starting 35,000 years ago, as soon as the glaciers melted, human beings have had these incredible drives. And the foundation of them is the desire to understand, because fundamentally we are the creature with this natural capacity to understand, and that has evolved over time. We also developed the conscious awareness of our power of choice, which means that we have to choose deliberately how to use our various capacities. And we can know that people disagree, and then we test. We can learn from history. We can educate ourselves. So the whole mythological tradition is just like the scientific tradition. In science, scientists are teaching themselves about the universe, passing on what they know to the next generation about these patterns underlying nature. Well, mythology and religion was the same thing, except it was about practical wisdom and how to educate emotions so that people would actually act in the way that they ought to act, and then also educating our ability to understand. First of all, understand an emotion, identify a certain emotion as revenge or as goodwill, right? So you have these patterns, then you have these emotions, then you have recognized patterns, then you start to be able to categorize them. Then you realize that they are in a category because they're related to part of our experience as human beings, the human condition. Then you start to figure out how some ways of some emotions really are always destructive. And whenever you identify that kind of situation where you could have that emotion, and that you wouldn't, either you feel it but you know you shouldn't act on it, or you learn not to even want to feel that way. The whole tradition is very much human beings educating themselves about how to be completely human. And being completely human is being wise, and it's complete integrity, right? The integration of the inner life, family life, economic life, all aspects of social life, and the natural universe, life in the natural world, and the universe itself.